My name is Tony Seeger, and I'm a professor of ethnomusicology at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. I've been here for about 8 years, and I teach both undergraduates and graduate students and advise dissertations on research being undertaken all over the world. I'm a specialist in the music of the Indians of the central part of Brazil called Mato Grosso, and I've lived in Brazil for about 10 years and lived in an indigenous village there for about 2 with my wife and learned the language and settled in and exchanged music with them. I learned their music, and they also were really happy that we brought our banjo or guitar along so they could sing and learn our music too. And that made me an ethnomusicologist in a sense. I've been writing about that kind of music and other kinds of music ever since. So the role of music is in that society is really quite important because it's one of the ways that society is constructed. Traditionally there were no clocks, there were no seasons, there were no directions, and music is what defines those. Music begins the rainy season, music ends the rainy season, even if it's still raining or starting to be dry. Those are the way time is done, and space is also clarified by where you make music, where you don't make music, is a way of creating society, and it's a way of creating relationships among people. You sing songs for certain people in ceremonies, and you don't sing for other people. And so through music, which is a particular concrete way of relating to people, they create a lot of aspects of their society. It's supposed to be a daily activity. It doesn't always happen every day, but every morning is supposed to begin with song. In the men's house pre-dawn, let's say about the time the morning star rises, 4:30 or 5. It was tough doing field work there. I have to get up with them every morning and get out there and sing. And then they would usually be singing in the evening as well. And when they were building up to a major ceremony, and for weeks beforehand, they'd be singing every afternoon and every morning and every night. And sometimes some solo singer would go singing all night long, walking around and around and around and singing songs, solo songs, for the whole village and the whole society, in a sense, to hear. They use very few instruments of the kind that we think of. The major instrument was the voice, along with a rattle, and various kinds of rattles made from individual nuts or sometimes put inside a globule-shaped thing. But for the most part, it was a voice. What really mattered to them was voice, much more than anything else. They were uninterested in playing the banjo that I brought and playing the guitar that I hung on the wall for anybody to walk in and pick up, because what they really wanted to do was learn our songs. And so they could sing verse after verse of the ballad Pretty Polly about a man who murders his lover, without really knowing what it meant, but because they liked the particular melody that it was in, and they never picked up the banjo or asked me to show them how to play it. So music is different to different people. They think about it differently. They teach their children how to sing, and by making them sing from the time they're very little, expecting them to sing. And so children start participating in the major ceremonies as soon as they can walk, pretty much. And they learn by imitating and following their parents, and they're taught simple songs at first when they're young, and then the songs that they learn, the solo songs, get more and more complicated as they get older. And by the time they're teenagers, the young men are supposed to be able to sing and remember things, hearing them once and then go out and sing them. There are musical leaders. There are some people who have a special ability to hear animals or fish or natural species of some kind or another and learn their songs and then teach them. So their idea of composition is more like a radio. It's transmitted by nature and comes out of a human mouth, and people learn it. And those are often the specialists in ceremonies. They know all the songs that exist, and they also can introduce new songs that don't yet exist in repertory. It's a society where there are new songs for everybody every time there's a ceremony. It looks like it's been there forever, but in fact it's always changing. Techniques and the approach pretty much remain the same, even though they're adding new songs. And they've specifically not started to play Brazilian music, country music, forró and música sertaneja and things like that, because they see that as really different. Although they sing the songs of 8 other Indian groups, and they sing songs of anthropologists like me that have been there, and they draw the line at actually playing the instruments of other groups.
Can you sing a song?
Well, I could. Let's see. There's one about butterflies. In a certain season, the butterflies go flying in rivers just above the earth, and they're flying sort of in and out. And this is talking about the intermixing of the rivers of butterflies flying. It goes, ooh, ho ha ji he, ah ooh, ho ha ji he, ah ooh, ho ha ji he, ah ooh, ah ji he, yeah, ooh ah hoo karanantiu, no wakara nonke isuru nonke we dai bendam ramani mumbrane wakara nonke isura nonke we dai menda jamani mumra ahu hu ho ha ji he hu ho ha ji he hu ho ha ji he hu hui. That's a shortened version of a rather longer song, but they do it in a group, and it's neatly syncopated with the stamping of their feet on the earth. So it's a rather neat bit of rhythm and singing, and they sing that especially during the rainy season. That's a rainy season song. They don't separate dance from music. There's the same word for both. They don't say that there's dance and then there's music, and I think it's partly because every song has its own way of movement with it. And the movement is often creating the percussive sound that's central to the thing. The rattles may be tied to the leg, and so stamping on the ground will shake the rattle at the right moment. And yes, in South America and many other places in the world, music and dance aren't really separate. They're part of the same event, and they don't talk about them much apart from one or another. Well, all of the Suya, I'm talking about the Suya Indians in central Brazil, and all of their music is related to ceremonies somehow. They have no protest songs, they have no lullabies. When you want to put a baby to sleep, you just go shh, but you don't ever sing a song to it. That's not what's done. So their use of music is very specific. It's about sacred things, it's about creating society and recreating relationships, and so their music is kind of formal, and they always paint themselves and dress themselves in a particular way before performing. I mean, if you're going to do a real performance, then you take off your daily clothes if you're wearing clothes, strip naked, put certain ornaments on, paint yourself red and black and whatever else, and then you dance. So a bit like people used to do for going to the opera or playing in the symphony, they would put on certain clothes in order to play that music, and that's true as well in many Brazilian Indian societies. I think my students can benefit a lot and do benefit from understanding the music of other cultures, even if they're going to spend most of their life playing jazz or playing music here in the United States. And the reason is that the particular part of the sonic spectrum that we use, the particular sets of sounds that we combine in our own tradition, is only one of many possible sets. And other societies have explored other parts of sound that we haven't even thought about, or hardly thought about, like the bipolar singing, when you sort of sing in an undertone, you got the overtones, or in the case of South American Indians, who cut out all the instruments that they've ever heard. They don't even bother with them because they're really interested in the voice and the particular relationship that voices have with one another. And that makes one think, well, gee, that's sort of neat. Maybe we could try that. And we get a lot of people listening to the music of different parts of the world and saying, well, that's really interesting. That's a way I've never thought of sound working. And that's, I think, one of the contributions of ethnomusicology to music practice. Well, that's an old story in the sense that I was born into a family of musicians. I have an uncle named Pete Seeger, and I have another uncle, Mike Seeger, and an aunt, Peggy Seeger. And so I was born into a family where, in the older generation, everybody sang. My parents sang. And my grandfather was the founder of the Society for Ethnomusicology and was a musicologist himself. So I grew up as a kid singing. And in the 1950s, I discovered very young, about 6, that music could get you into a lot of trouble, because my uncle was brought up before the House Un-American Activities Committee and then later processed in court for contempt of Congress for not telling people who he was singing for and saying he thought he didn't have to. And so I always thought, well, music is really interesting because it makes people angry and makes them scared. And so I thought, well, that was a new aspect of music. That one of the reasons I think I went on to become a musicologist was because if it's so powerful that people get thrown in jail for it, it must be doing something important. And so in college, when I decided there were too many Seegers out there making a living as performing musicians, I thought, I think I'll do something different. I think I'll study how it works and why people make it the way they do. And that sort of turned me towards ethnomusicology. Oh, I've been playing the banjo since I was 10, and I started on the violin because one of my grandmothers was a concert violinist, and then went on to a bunch of other instruments. But I never learned to play them so well. I think I hit my peak probably in high school when I was playing more than anything else. And when I decided to become an anthropologist and a student of music use, then I just didn't have as much time to play. I was too busy reading books and writing papers and today answering email. Though I am teaching sort of supervising an ensemble of old-time and bluegrass music here at UCLA. We have many ensembles in ethnomusicology, running from Javanese or Balinese gamelan to music of the Balkans to music of Afro-Cuban origins and all kinds of different music. And I thought it'd be sort of fun to revive an Anglo-American style, which is also important and important sort of in the history of country music, and that is bluegrass and some of its precursors. So I keep my hand in when I can. It's still hard to keep up with playing when you're trying to teach and keep up with your email. People who study classical music have become very proficient at a particular tradition which grew up in Europe in a couple of hundred years. And they often have not thought much about the other sounds around the world. And when they find them, they can be really excited by them. And some of them become ethnomusicologists. They already have the training in listening and playing music. And others of them take some of that music and try it out in their own styles and become composers that fuse various traditions together. Music has been traveling around a lot for a long time, but fusion isn't anything new. People have been doing it for a long time. The Suya Indians in Brazil were mixing music from different places. But it's very, very common now, and I think the internet has made sharing those fusions even easier than it ever was before. There's a tradition in Western European classical music composers to look at the local traditions of the country that they were in and to create compositions based on that music, but altering it in very significant ways to new harmonic structures and new larger sort of musical structures. That came apart partly because of the growth of nationalism, in which different regions of Europe were trying to establish their own independence and difference, and so composers were adding to that and building on that. But it also happened in the United States, where you had composers building on American folk song in the 1930s and 40s. What is happening now is somewhat different because people aren't looking to their own traditions necessarily to create fusions. They're actually looking around the whole world. The world is much more accessible than it was, and nationalism is in a sense being transcended by an international and global awareness of music and societies that wasn't true so much in the past. Yes, well, the European classical composers took some aspects of Turkish music and made that into something they called Turkish, and they also took aspects of, if they were in Germany, they would take some Italian things, and composers were moving around and playing music in different places. There was a lot of learning. Very few people compose straight out of nothing. They're usually composing out of something, and they're often adapting things that they think neat that other people have done. And today we'd probably get in trouble with copyright agencies for some of the things that the European composers were doing without second thoughts. In fact, as homage rather than as a ripoff. I'm interested in audio preservation, in the future of the recordings that have been made. We've got about 100 years a little bit more than 100 years of history in the recording industry. And it seems that every format we invent is a little worse than the next one, than the one before it in terms of how long it's going to last. There's a real danger that most of the music of the 20th century is going to be lost in the 21st century because it's recorded on very fragile pieces of tape or discs. And there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to play them in 20 years or 30 years. And if you look at how quickly the formats for music have changed in the last 10 years and video, then you think, well, gee, how are we ever going to be able to play things that we made 20 years ago when the systems are totally different? And people who are making the systems aren't really thinking about how they're going to recover the music that was on earlier systems. They're really trying to promote new systems. Ethnomusicology archivists think about this a lot because it's our job running an archive to preserve the music of the past, not just to study it, but also for the people in the future when the great-grandchildren of the musicians want to come and listen to the music so that they can relearn their great-grandparents' songs. And if we can't play them, then we've really failed one of our missions, and I think the world culture will be worse for it. If we lose the memory of our past, we have a real lack of resources for the future. We won't be able to recover that amazing way of singing that was recorded once before everybody forgot how to do it because they were too busy doing something else, but now want to learn again. And so I think the whole world needs to pay attention to it. UNESCO has created a day for the preservation of world music, but I think every country needs to be thinking very hard about its own traditions. And I say every country because most businesses don't have time or money to worry about preservation. They have to make money. They have stockholders, and they have to make money. They want to survive. It has to be somebody else's responsibility to say, hey, wait, there has to be some responsibility for preserving these wonderful things that we spent so much time trying to accumulate and that people were so inspired by in the past. The Library of Congress has a nice system for sort of designating certain recordings as landmark recordings in the history of the United States. And the idea is to call attention to how fragile those are and to make people think about their own collections. Well, I have colleagues who've digitized their collections onto CDRs or DVDs who think that's the end of the question, but it's not. The CDRs won't last more than a few years. The DVDs we know already start to deteriorate after 2 years. So long-term preservation has to be done in some other way, probably in some form of digital mass storage, the way banks store information, large amounts of information, with people who spend their entire lives just making sure that that information doesn't degrade and is constantly being migrated to future formats where it can be used. I think audio preservation is part of ethnomusicology. Actually, the first ethnomusicology grew up at an audiovisual archive founded in 1900 in Berlin, the Berlin Phonogram Archive. And that's because that was the first place you could actually hear music from many places in one place, and you could actually study music comparatively. Today, there are many archives around the country. The UCLA has an ethnomusicology archive of its own, but there are others in other places. And all of them are facing similar problems with these wonderful recordings that were made over the past century that are today very hard to preserve. And if we don't act fast, we won't be able to preserve them at all. Well, there are some projects underway to solve this, and one of them is projects to digitize and then store in large systems that will be preserved for the future and transferred. But it's a very hard thing to do for a small archive. It's much easier to do if you're part of a larger system. The Library of Congress has a very large system that it's trying to put in place to preserve its recordings. UCLA is part of the California Digital Library, and so when we digitize something, we don't keep it on a hard disk or just on a CDR. We also put it in the digital library of the state of California, which has a much better chance of surviving. It has several sites, it's well protected, and it's a much better chance of surviving into the future and being used. I think the real key is that when people themselves start looking into their past, then we'll see an impulse towards preservation. The so-called long tail that music companies are talking about today, meaning that the recordings of the past actually will continue to have value. I think archives are sort of thinking of the longest possible tail, because in fact archives find that people are coming to archives for the early recordings. They aren't coming for things they did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. What's really interesting are the things they did 90 years ago and they can't remember anymore, or they want to recover the way it was done because they've changed it and they want to compare, and they may not change back, but they want to know where they're coming from and where they're going with their music. So I think part of the future of music archives and preservation is going to be the use of archives by the general public. The industry is developing various kinds of formats that they hope will last a longer time. One of those is an archival CD, which may possibly last longer than the regular CD. There have been tests of how CDs are made, and the actual composition of the dye that's burned underneath changes, even though the name of the make doesn't change and the name of the period. The only way you can be sure that you have any consistency within most CDs is by buying a whole lot of them at once, and you assume they're made from the same batch. But it's not a very secure method, and when CDs are burned, that basically burns out the dye and sort of makes little holes that act as ones and twos and can be interpreted. Those are not very secure. Some tend to widen over time, and so we're not very happy with CDRs as a preservation medium. They're okay for a while. No one knows exactly how long, because they haven't been around that long. We all thought that digital audio tape, DAT tape, was going to be great. It turns out it doesn't last that long at all. And so the denser the information gets packed, the more densely it's packed, the more damage is done by any minor degradation of the material itself. For a long time, we were fortunate we had one type of tape, reel-to-reel audio tape, that seemed to do a really good job. The only thing was every time you copied it onto another tape, you raised the level of hiss and noise. And so eventually, in the long term, we all knew that we were going to have nothing left at the end but sound. So digital is a great advance, but it has problems of its own. It has problems in the material it's stored on, has problems in the changing basic software, underlying software that's needed to play it. I think today we're mostly working around WAV files, which are non-proprietary, and we think there's so many and it's fairly easy to migrate them to the future. We're thinking about a certain sampling rate, double the sampling rate on most CDs, because the CDs are not the ideal sampling rate. They're ideal for being able to fit 73 minutes of music on, but if you want that 73 to sound better, it really is important to sample it twice as often at least, and so and we can do that. It's just we can't put it on CDs anymore. We have to have a larger medium in which to store it. DVD in the short term, but preferably getting it to a mass storage system where it's actually being self-checked, because the large storage system actually check themselves, and so they're inevitable sort of random changes in things, and bits get out of place and things like that. But a self-checking one will begin to see when it's got a problem, and replace the tape. You do some error checking on it, and when there's a certain number of errors, you replace it. It's hard to do that kind of checking with a DVD. Most people won't do it. They'll just make the DVD, put it on the shelf. And we've found that in as little as 2 years, you can lose 5% of those DVDs. And at least in one case of an archive that was digitizing video, it found that some of them weren't playable even if they've been stored in very cold conditions after only a few years. The most important thing for storing tape, if you've got tapes, cassette tapes or reel-to-reel tapes, is humidity. If you can control the humidity and keep it pretty stable, that will go a long way towards their lasting longer until you find a solution you want to have for them. The same thing goes for keeping CDRs and DVDs. It's better to keep them dry, and it's better to keep them in the dark. I often use a large picnic cooler with some silica gel in it and close it up pretty tightly, and that at least the picnic cooler keeps it from wide changes in temperature, and the silica gel keeps it sort of relatively dry, and you try to keep it from wide changes in those, because the tapes, especially, every time they stretch when they get wet and they shrink or when they get dry, and so every time they're doing that, they're putting stress on the layers in between them. CDRs also have several layers, and the layers may interact with one another chemically. They'll be much less apt to do so if it's kept dry and in the dark. One of the courses I teach here at UCLA is about the music business. And I teach it because I ran a record company at the Smithsonian Institution for 12 years called Folkways Records. I was its curator, and I founded Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, and then worked on various ways to make it available digitally through Global Sound. And I was convinced, and I am convinced, that you can't understand the music of the United States unless you understand the industry of which it's a part. Because that industry has shaped the way songs are, it's shaped the length of the songs, it's shaped the instrumentation that's possible, it's shaped the voice that has been used at various moments in the history of music. And if you don't understand that, you're talking about style as if it existed in a vacuum, and it exists always in an industry. So I have two objectives in the course. One is to help musicologists understand the music of the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries. And then I also have a number of students who are in my classes who are musicians who want to figure out, well, what am I going to do? How do I make a living in this thing? I'm going to be part of this industry. How do I get ahead? And so the course has two parts. One is a more historical part that begins in the 17th century with early manuscripts and sort of the changing of music through publication and sheet music, right up to the present with the sharing of music on Facebook and MySpace and things like that. And what I'm trying to do is do both historically and also in the present. I think it's very important for musicians who are graduating as performers to have some idea of what a contract is about, how it's written, and what their options are for making modifications and how you negotiate things. And if they're coming out as performers with no idea of the industry, it seems to me they're going to make some very bad mistakes early on, as many musicians have made. When you're young and innocent, you often sign a contract that you only discover the implications of afterwards, and it seems to me it's very easy not to do that. Similarly, it's very easy if you don't understand what the royalty structure is and how it works on a record label, to make wrong assumptions about what you're being told. I mean, I'll give you 10% royalty. Well, 10% of what? And only if you sort of have some abstract knowledge of it can it really make sense. And so I think making sense of things in a fairly simple way for undergraduate students can help them avoid major problems later on. I was surprised as I traveled around the country talking in various music schools how little music industry is being taught in most music departments. That may be changing now, but in the last 10 years at least, there are places that are producing hundreds of musicians, and there's not a single course on music law. There's not a single course on negotiation of performance rights. There's not a single course on the role of unions and sort of what your options are in terms of becoming a working professional. And I think that's a real lack, because I think musicians, once they get out there, suddenly realize they have to know those things, and we should be teaching them. We should be helping them and discussing it with them and working with them on it. Until 1890s or so, most music in the world was live. You could only hear the same thing twice if you had a player piano maybe or some kind of music box. And it really changed music a lot when it could be recorded, because you could hear it over and over again, and you could make one copy, you could play it, record it once, and eventually make copies that would be heard all over. It did a number of things to music. It shaped the length of songs, since you could only get about 2.5 minutes or 3 minutes on first a cylinder or 78 RPM record. They were standardized. Songs suddenly became a standardized length. And then people would hear them and assume that was the way songs should be. So everybody began to sing 3-minute songs because the technology did it, not because the music before had anything to do with 3 minutes. And similarly, there were other changes that happened with the limitations of the sound and certain things. Certain instrumentation became more important and possible in the wax cylinder that wasn't used before. You have a crooning voice that was important for radio because the radio mic could pick up a crooning voice better than a loudly projected voice. And so you have all kinds of ways in which recordings and other technologies have really shaped the music that we hear today. And the other things that happen is some of the diversity is lost. And it's not just diversity of musics in different parts of the world. There used to be orchestras used to have a certain sound in Germany, a different sound in England, a different sound in the United States, and most of that's gone today, partly because they're all listening to each other's recordings, and partly because of the technology of finding the best possible sound for each instrument and the idea that there is a perfection, and we should all share it. So some diversity is being lost. On the other hand, think of all the things that would never have happened if there hadn't been recordings. We would never have been influenced by musics of people that we didn't actually see face to face, and all kinds of things would be very different. The last 10 years have seen a tremendous change in the way music is shared and learned, and it's coming much less from commercial recordings and much more from people sharing music on the internet and file sharing or making their own music and sharing it that way. I think it's very exciting, and I think it's just another example of the kinds of radical changes that have happened over and over again in the history of the music industry, from publishing sheet music to making player pianos that then went out when the sound of music got better, and various sort of changes in style between the 78 RPM and the LP, which created a possibility for albums. Just constant changes, and some people at every stage have gone out of business, and other people have moved in and made money. People are listening to more music today than they've ever listened to in the past. It's just they're listening to it differently in different ways, and I don't see that as a major problem for me personally. I see it as a problem for certain industries that may simply go out of business. They may simply disappear because other industries are going to take their place. It may be that it's not an accident that some musicians today are signing not with record companies but with touring companies or with other agencies that are going to put their music on, because the recording may not be the most important. The commercial recording sold for profit may not be the most important way of getting their music around anymore. It may be file sharing and live performances, selling T-shirts, selling tickets. Or it may be something that we haven't even thought about. It may be new ways of supporting artists. It may be voluntary donations for the music, as Radiohead has, I think, recently experimented with. And I think if musicians can find a way to get their music out, and if they can find a way to make a living, they'll do it. And the various industries that supported them in the past aren't necessarily going to be the ones that are going to support them in the future. In the last few years, I've seen an increasing number of students making their own music on their computers at home. And so you have home studios, home computer creation, and then dissemination of their own music that way in a massive scale. And so I think one of the things that happens is that the idea of making music becomes making music yourself and less with other people. And another thing is that everybody does it and everybody can get heard, which is something that has occurred recently because of the vast use of the internet to exchange files on. And it's not people necessarily only exchanging copyrighted files. They're often exchanging their own latest music, and that's a really active and important part of what I see here. Many of the students are themselves composers in a way that was, and published composers because they're doing it themselves in a way that was never possible before. I think the importance of understanding the context of music is central to ethnomusicology, partly because when we play our own music, let's say we're specialists in European classical music, we assume a lot of the context. We know it's made for concerts and all those things, and we don't know that about a gamelan concert or something like that. So ethnomusicologists say, well, we really need to understand context if we're going to understand how that music came to be the way it is and why it's being played by the performers that it is and things like that, why people care about it in the countries. So I think context is very important. That's why sort of an anthropology asks different questions. You don't have to be an anthropologist to enjoy music. You don't have to be an ethnomusicologist to enjoy it. You can enjoy it any way you like it. And people can often play it a little. But if they want to understand how to really play it, they really have to often do more research than just listening to a recording and reproducing the recording. They have to, and they often do. They listen to many recordings, and they may travel to the place and talk to musicians, talk to composers, or get on the internet and talk to musicians and talk to composers, and in that way give themselves the context that allows them to do a better job of appreciating the music for what it is and understanding why it is the way it is. One of the reasons I went to Brazil to do my study of the music of the indigenous peoples there was I wanted to get to a society that wasn't part of the capitalist system. I wanted to get beyond commodity. I wanted to find out what music was where it wasn't a commodity, and I had to go pretty far to do that. I had to, in a sense, get beyond the frontier, get to a place where they didn't have any money at all, and where there was no place to spend money if you had it. It would take me weeks to get to a store, for example, if I ran out of something, and weeks to get back in. So I was really interested in that question: is it different? And it's certainly different. I mean, the music is not commodified, or hasn't been. I've commodified it myself with their request. I've made an LP of their recordings and then a CD and a videotape, a DVD. But that was at their request, not because and because they see this happening around them. But in a sense, it's quite different. And there's a whole lot of local music that wasn't ever very commodified. You have a whole lot of people sitting around their houses singing songs, washing dishes, singing songs, playing at local dances, and they aren't making money at it, but it's a way of making society out of it. So I think side by side with our own commercial industry, there's also a large, not very commercial industry that's influenced by that industry, but is also going its own route, and people having fun making music that they aren't ever going to make a penny out of. It's what they do after they're finished working all day or driving all day or whatever it might be. Not every culture in the world commodifies music, but in almost every, if you have professional musicians, in other words, you have musicians who spend all of their time making music, then somehow they have to be taken care of, and they have to eat, and that implies some kind of commodification, not necessarily in the sense of commodity of making many copies of something, but in the sense of somebody supporting it. And very often the political leaders or patrons of some kind of support, or churches or religious groups have supported musicians. When you get to certain moments in the history of European music, you suddenly reach a moment when it's actually the printing press and the ability to sell scores and copyright and sort of make money by selling scores that the composers begin to make a different kind of living off their music. And then so they aren't necessarily needing patrons anymore because they have other ways to make the music. They can sell their sheet music, or they can sell their own performances and things like that. And that changes over time, but it's certainly the commodification of music becomes particularly acute with the publication of recordings, where you suddenly can make millions of recordings and those really are commodities. But a whole lot of musicians never made recordings. Some of those are put out of business by these new changes in technologies. When the record industry hit the 1930s, we suddenly had a depression around the world, and many of the record companies went broke. And the record industry as an industry was partly saved by the jukebox, which went into bars all around the country, and you could put a nickel in and you could get a song played back. And they made a lot of money on jukebox sales at a time when no one else could afford to buy records, but they could afford to play at a time. And that put a whole lot of working musicians out of job, of course, because it's a whole lot cheaper to have a jukebox in your place than actually pay anybody to play there. And so these changes of the industry and commodification have put a whole lot of people out of work. There's no question that a lot of working musicians are today being put out of work by disco and by the use of discs instead. I mean, people who take their iPod and do the party instead of bringing a band to do the party. But that's always been happening. It's people wring their hands and say the world is coming to an end. The world isn't coming to an end. It's been coming to an end ever since the beginning of professional music. It's always been changing, and people have always lost money on it, and other people have always made money on it, and musicians still actually play, and they still want to be musicians. People still want to be musicians in spite of all these things that are changing for them. And I think it's exciting that they do. I hope we have a society in which it's worth and appreciated for people to be musicians in, and I hope that ethnomusicologists will understand what this process is all about and help the rest of the world understand it too. When a person comes to me and says, well, what is ethnomusicology and how do I find out about it? I often recommend that they look at a couple of nice textbooks that have already been written, because they're written by people who are fairly thoughtful about it. And there's one by Kay Chalamet on soundscapes, in which he doesn't identify music with a region, but actually talks about how music is shared and used in different societies. Sometimes I recommend them to some books by Bruno Nettel, who's perhaps the most famous ethnomusicologist today. He's written more books, I think, than most of us, and he has written a number of textbooks on sort of ethnomusicology, and there's a nice one on 31 essays and issues in ethnomusicology, I think it's called. Sometimes if they say, well, what's it like to study the music of another place, I recommend my own book, which is called Why Suya Sing, and it has a CD in the back, and I have a DVD that I hope will go in the back of the next edition, which I think gives you an idea of what it's like to go to a place where music isn't a commodity, and how music is used in really rather different ways for different things, because it's not used to make a living, it's used to do something very profound for the society, and has nothing to do with fun in the sense of it's music isn't something that's sort of optional. It's something that everybody does, and they do it for certain reasons. So I sometimes recommend an ethnography like that of a really different kind of music. And if they want to learn about the music industry, well, there are a bunch of really good books on that. I often recommend Passman's book on the music business, and because he's some people write better than others, and I find that students can actually relate to people who write with a certain sort of sardonic tone, and Passman does, and I think I'll be recommending them to your website because there's a whole lot of information there. I think that the exciting thing about it now is that most of them who are interested will already find your website even before they come to see me. But when they do, and I often point people in different directions, different kinds of sources. There are some books, there are some audio resources, and there are some great things on the web that already can help them think about these things. People have often asked me whether in the past there were more people making music, because one of the things that the music industry has done is we listen to more music that other people make than we make ourselves in most cases. I think that's happened on the one hand. I think if in the past many families had a piano in their living room or in their salon, some of them could play it, some of them couldn't, but they would get around the piano and sing and perform themselves. That was partly because the music that was available was sheet music and you had to play it, or you put a player piano there that actually had little knobs that would play it for you. I think today that's changing back a bit. Today people are actually, I think, making more music than they used to. My uncle Pete Seeger used to lament that no one sang anymore, so he had people sing in his concerts. But I said, Pete, have you ever been to a rock concert? People are singing the whole time. They can't hear themselves sing necessarily, but they're up there and they're singing the songs because they know them by heart. And so I think there's more music being made today than people give other people credit for in the United States. I think a lot of people are making it, and I think with computers and file sharing, a whole lot more people are making it. They can post their own latest composition, their own latest song, and it's a stimulus to compose and write and get it out there. And it's also a mechanism that allows more people than ever possible in the past to do so. It's tough sometimes to be a parent because your children are always making decisions and you aren't always sure that they're the smartest decisions because you see the world from your perspective and your generation and your own profession. And so when your child says, I want to become a musician, if you're not in a family of musicians like mine, it can be pretty scary. And I think the main thing to think about as a parent is that your child may be a really great musician. And they don't have to sound great to you to actually change the world. I don't know what Bob Dylan's sound and his voice changed a whole way of thinking about writing songs and singing songs. And that's one person having a huge impact. And he actually heard Woody Guthrie. And it was Woody Guthrie that sort of influenced Bob Dylan to then influence the world. So you have people who impact other people in ways that are profoundly important. And your child could be one of those. The other thing is that people don't make a decision about their whole life. They may be a musician for a while, and then they may decide they're going to go work in the music industry for a while, or write software, or become a great painter. People do a lot of different things in their lives. And when my students say, what am I going to do with my life? I say, well, just concentrate on what you're going to do next in your life, because after that, you may say, I'm going to do something different. And a lot of musicians do. Some musicians open restaurants. Some musicians, I know, work in radio. Ethnomusicologists are all over the place, and musicians are all over the place. And I think the world is better for them. And I certainly think it would be a shame if no one could become a musician because there was no way to support yourself as a musician. I think in that case we have to rethink the way society and also business worked. But at the moment, the ambition of becoming a musician is something that parents should be delighted with, and also sensible about, and also maybe suggest they attend some music business courses and things like that, so they have some other skills in addition to performing and composing that they can use their composing in music, and also use as other ways of making a living when that may be interesting.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
It's been fun.